I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program coming to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We are nearing the end of our long series of programs on the Holocaust of the Germans, of the plan, in other words, to wipe out the Germans. And it comes as a reaction to a number of books that have been released. One of these here is Germany Must Perish. Then this one here, An Eye for an Eye by John Sack, that told of the untold story of Jewish revenge against Germans in 1945. Also, the revelations contained in this book are The Losses by the Canadian author James Buck, who talks about the murder of between 1 and 2 million German soldiers and civilians in Eisenhower's death camps, which was in Canada certainly a very large story, dominating the kind of intellectual circles for quite some time. Saturday Night Magazine is Canada's premier intellectual magazine. It devoted a long, but virtually the whole magazine to this story here. And the author, James Buck, has, of course, since published another book, couldn't find an English language publisher for it, Of Crimes and Mercy, in which he claims that because of a deliberate Allied policy, the German nation lost between 9 and 10 million people after the war was over. After the war was over. In other words, once the shooting stopped. And this we have to put into the context of what this book, Germany Must Perish, had advocated. And I just read it to you with one sentence. This dynamic volume outlines a comprehensive plan for the extinction of the German nation and the total eradication from the earth of all her people. Now, of course, people will say that the Germans had it coming to them, and the Germans are responsible for their own misfortune. And I just want to quickly turn to an American book. The writer of the book was none other than the former Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. On page 121, he quotes a diary entry that he played golf with Joe Kennedy, the father of President Kennedy, today, on the 27th of December, 1945, and that he asked Kennedy what he thought Chamberlain's ideas were and plans were in 1938. And the father of President Kennedy's view as the ambassador to London then was that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for the constant urging on of William C. Bullitt, then ambassador to France, who urged on Roosevelt in the summer of 1939 that the Germans must be faced down over Poland. And he says that Chamberlain said, neither the French nor the British would have made Poland a cause for war if it had not been for the constant needling from Washington. Bullitt, he said, kept telling Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight, Kennedy that they would, and that they would overrun Europe. And then Prime Minister Chamberlain of England, he says, stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war. So we have the father of President Kennedy speaking to this famous American political leader and Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, saying that the world's Jews were behind the war. And of course, what we also have is admissions in this book called Gruesome Harvest. And it is that there was war decided already. That war had already been decided on. It's on page 125 in this book, Gruesome Harvest, an American book published in 1947, in which the writer says that the Lord Lothian, the then British ambassador to the United States, said in March 1938, which was about half a year before hostilities really got going, he said the following: if another war comes, and the history of it is ever written, the dispassionate historian 100 years hence will say not that Germany alone was responsible for it, even if she strikes first, but that those who mismanaged the world between 1918 and 1937 had a large share of responsibility in it. Now, since that time, 60 years have gone into the land, and of course, the British ambassador to the United States could not know then how powerful the basically Holocaust or Jewish lobby would be in the world, in a post-war world. But what he says here is important to remember, that the dispassionate historian would give the Germans a much fairer shake than the propagandists who have since appeared with books, the kind of court historians like Martin Gilbert and William Shearer and so on. One thing that we should remember before people are so quick to pin the blame for all that befell the world on the Germans and on Adolf Hitler's government, in what Karl von Wiegand wrote in his column April the 23rd, 1944, in which he reports having a meeting 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland with the ambassador of the United States to France, William C. Bullitt, that we mentioned here in the Forrestal Diaries, who was, according to the father of President Kennedy, a warmonger who kept misinforming Roosevelt that the Germans would not fight over Poland. And so William Bullitt meets this American writer, Karl von Wiegand, and he says, this is how Wiegand remembers it: on April 1939, 4 months before Hitler invaded Poland, Ambassador William C. Bullitt, whom I had known for 20 years, called me to the American embassy in Paris, both of us standing before the fireplace in his office, the windows of which faced the beautiful Place de la Concorde. The American ambassador told me that war had been decided upon. 4 months before the war broke out, the American ambassador to France, William C. Bullitt, knew that war had been decided upon. By whom? By whom? Since he is an American ambassador, had the ear of President Roosevelt, chances are that he must have known who in America and who were the forces behind Roosevelt who had decided that war would come. Because, as Forrestal says, not even the British Prime Minister at that time, Neville Chamberlain, much vilified, laughed at with his umbrella and peace in our time slogan. He did not want war. Obviously, he was a decent and honorable man, and he was eclipsed by warmongers like Roosevelt and in America, and warmongers like Churchill in England. And of course, by now today, we know that Churchill had made some very bad gambling debts and played the stock market and had kind of bought on margin, and some friendly Jewish financiers, I think one of them is called Strakosch, a Czech Jew, came to his rescue, and apparently Bernard Baruch also. So he was in the pocket of this advisor to presidents, who obviously also was an advisor to President Roosevelt. He had been in charge of the war production board in the First World War already. He had asked for some stupendous German reparations to be paid after the First World War, when Hitler was an unknown. In other words, Bernard Baruch had a hatred of Germans that can only be considered when one checks into his tribal background. And so he, Baruch, Morgenthau, they were already waiting in the wings together with Roosevelt and his coterie of advisors. One of them, I'm given to understand, a friend of his speechwriter. Then here was Theodor Nathan Kaufmann, the man who wanted to eradicate the German nation. Is it any surprise then that the Morgenthau plan is evolved in the United States, and that Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam agreements are made that are absolutely favorable to Marxism, devastating to Europe and Western civilization and to freedom on the continent? Basically, America went to war to make the world safe for communism. As simple as that. It might sound shocking to Americans, but it was American intervention, American materiel, American Lend-Lease that was sent to save Stalin's hide. The Germans, to all intents and purposes, had defeated the evil empire, as President Reagan would call it 50 years later. My father was picking up the wounded German soldiers from the battlefields of Stalingrad and of Moscow. The Germans were on the outskirts of Moscow already when the terror bombing campaign began to wipe out German war production plants and German civilians. When 58,000 people in Hamburg were bombed into death, mostly women and children. So this was the turning point, Stalingrad. From that moment on, when American help for the Soviets began to arrive in huge numbers, when 500,000 trucks and 10,000 ship engines and enough uniforms to equip armies of millions of men, enough copper wires to go around the earth apparently 18 times, and so on. And even a shag pipe for Joe Stalin were delivered to the Soviet Union. American help, American lend-lease made the world safe, not for democracy, but for one of the worst despotisms that, believe me, for anyone in Europe that knew the situation in Europe, was far worse than Adolf Hitler's regime ever was. Now, in previous programs and previous series, we have looked at the alleged Holocaust against the Jews, and we will so again in the future. Let me just say that Carl von Wiegand reports the American ambassador, a friend of his for 20 years, saying that 4 months before the first shot was fired in anger, that war had been decided upon. Hitler's fault? Hitler's fault was before the invasion of Poland, where the Poles were murdering Germans by the thousands, ethnic Germans that they held illegally, contrary to the promises of the Versailles Treaty and so on. So, the forces behind Roosevelt and whoever they were in the world had decided against a war against Adolf Hitler. So let's not be so hasty and blame all the tragedy on the Germans. Then also, of course, we have studied for this series the bellicosity of the Germans. And we have quoted Harry Elmer Barnes, who says, England has been a way out in front in point of relative bellicosity among the nations, while Germany and the Netherlands stand at the very bottom of the list next to Denmark. And that in the 500 years that Quincy writes in his book, A Study of War, examined from 1480 to 1940, there were 278 wars involving European countries, and again Germany, including Prussia, were at the end of it. And that the number of countries who were at war for what number of years, that's Pitrim Sorokin in Volume 3, Part 2 of his book, Social and Cultural Dynamics, says that if you go all the way back from the 12th century to 1925, you will find that of all the countries in Europe involved in wars, Spain led Europe, Poland 58, England 56 years at war, France 50 years, Russia 46 years, Holland 44 years, Italy 36 years, Germany from the 12th century to 1925 was at war exactly 28 years, which is less than half of what Spain was and about half of what England was. And then Professor Barnes, the father of American revisionism, goes on and basically excoriates the President of the United States and says that President Truman has well said that constructive public acts must be based on truth. It's too bad somebody could not have whispered a little truth into his ear before he left for Potsdam. There is little prospect that a structure erected wholly on lies in 1945 will endure any better than the one that was wholly based on lies in 1919. So here is the Dean of American Revisionist Historian Professors already saying in 1945 and 6 that Potsdam was as much based on lies as the Versailles Treaty. And he says that, and the probability is that the disillusionment after Potsdam will set in much more rapidly than it did after Versailles. In the period after 1919, we had to wait some years to obtain formally secret documents to upset the lies of the period of war and peacemaking. This time the upsetting facts are already available and so clear that honest and informed men can read them while running. The only thing that we have to wait for is courage enough to state today what is today well known and above serious doubt, in short, to know that an honest historian will not be listed immediately as a defendant in a mass sedition trial. Well, that's exactly what happened. and is still hanging on to this day. In Germany, historians have their cars firebombed, their houses firebombed and smeared at. They are jailed, arrested, charged, convicted by the current German state if they question the Allied version of history. And that's now over 50 years ago. The German Quislings are still dragging their historians, in pillorying them. In France, it is the same. In America, people like James Back in Canada and in America, of course, since he's talking about Dwight Eisenhower's death camps, are experiencing the same kind of repression. They are vilified and silenced. They've been given the silent treatment. Now, Barnes couldn't know that in free America this could take place, but it is taking place. And Prime Minister Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, admitted that he had worked all his life for this conflagration. He said, "I cannot believe that there is any fact in the whole world which can compare with the fact that now that America has joined the British Commonwealth of Nations against the Germans. That is what I dreamed of, aimed at, and worked for, and now it has come to pass." And so the writer here discusses briefly the Lend-Lease program had been squeezed through Congress by the narrowest of margins as a peace measure. Senator Glass, a Jewish senator, had given away its real purpose, however, when he said he favored loaning Great Britain all the war equipment we could spare to wipe Germany off the face of the map. He had the courage to say what was on his mind of many as a figure in Washington and elsewhere. And so Hitler has been condemned as a violator of international pacts and agreements, yet when we sent destroyers to Britain long before Pearl Harbor and later on permitted many of our vessels to be commandeered by British officers, we violated Section 3 of Article 5 of the Act of June 15, 1917, which provides that during a war in which the United States is a neutral nation, it shall be unlawful to send out of the jurisdiction of the United States any vessel built, armed, or equipped as a vessel of war with any intent or with reasonable cause to believe that it shall be used by any belligerent nation. And we also violated the Hague Convention, which forbids a neutral nation to supply any war materials whatever to any belligerent country. And he says there is no need to pursue the argument. We have shown that the good grounds exist for doubting in some degree, at least, the charge that the German people, because of their perverse natures and their will and lust for war, were the sole culprits in the late conflict. Well, if the American ambassador 4 months before the war started already knew that a war was coming, then the Germans are hardly to blame, because these Germans had nothing to do with that. And we then go and we looked at this here. Disraeli, the British Prime Minister under Queen Victoria, he said, "All great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed, some of the principal characters never appear, and all who figure are so misunderstood and misrepresented that the result is a complete mystification. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished." You can say the absolute same about Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, the German High Command, the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and so on. The history of Europe has not been written properly. It has only been Allied propaganda posing as history. And so the world would be astonished if they could ever get a glimpse at a totally unfettered history. And hopefully, people like myself will find enough resonance out there in radio and TV land to find these people so that we can finally deliver to the world a state of the world message, unfettered and not purposely mystified, as Disraeli said. And then we'll just quote the British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin after the war, who said that propaganda of the lower level when he said, "At the London Conference of Foreign Ministers, February 10th, 1946, a newspaper has 3 things to do. One is to amuse, another is to entertain, and the rest is to mislead." And I claim that the Allied world, when it comes to things German, has been exactly guilty of that. And we have discussed at great length the idea of balance of power, and how this balance of power by banksters, meaning bankers and gangsters in high places, have been the death knell of many a country and even civilizations. And so it just upsets me when I think how many good people died, how much European history could have been different, how much European culture was sent back, and how many people died needlessly and painfully, how many people lost their lives, their wives, sweethearts, children, their valued possessions, how many great paintings, how many great churches, edifices, cities were wiped out in this insane, murderous campaign because of this balance of power thinking in the Allied world against the Germans. And they say in the balance of power, already in articles written in 1943, it makes no difference if the leader in Germany would be a Nazi or communist or socialist. After all, the First World War was fought just as murderously for that very same policy against a Kaiser who had nothing but Jews surrounding him. So it wasn't Hitler's anti-Jewish policy. That was the kind of propaganda crap that people were fed. The fact was Germany was too strong, too virile, too efficient a competitor in the world market, and many a force coalesced to destroy it so that they could go on their merry ways and didn't have to feel disturbed in their comfortably situated country clubs, lodges, and so on. And so Germany was finished to all intents and purposes. And this writer here outlines in his book a brief plan of how we could rescue Germany. Let me just give you the highlights. Rush emergency food supplies to Germany. We're talking here Germany in 1946-47. Raise the base diet to 2,200 calories per person per day immediately and to 2,500 calories during this winter. Permit the Central Red Cross to function. Remove all limitations to private relief. Organize great drives under the sponsorship of government, if possible, to provide clothing, fuel, medicine, and other necessities now lacking. Free all German war prisoners, return them to Germany, and provide them with the tools needed so they can work in Germany to feed and otherwise provide for the German people, and thereby remove a heavy burden from our shoulders. Give all prisoners full union wages for work exacted from them since VE Day, to enable them to re-establish themselves and to provide for their surviving dependents. Return all German lands and restore the Reich to 1937 borders. Hold plebiscites in all other territories heavily populated by Germans in 1937, Danzig in Austria included, to determine in harmony with the Atlantic Charter under what flag these people wish to live. To relieve the present unbearable population pressure, encourage all countries with low population densities, such as the United States, Canada, Latin America, Australia, and Africa, to lower the bars and permit the excess German populations to immigrate. Extend all possible aid to rebuild German cities, restore essential public service, and create decent housing facilities. Remove all limitations to industrial production and encourage highest possible output, except munitions, in harmony with the themes that prosperity like peace is indivisible. Encourage German foreign trade in order to enable the Germans to maintain themselves as soon as possible. Place a value on the mark in terms of other currencies to make private German foreign trade possible. Permit production and operation of commercial airships and ocean-going vessels. Rehabilitate national finances and forestall inflation by stabilizing the currency. Contract existing currency by calling in outstanding marks and exchanging them for new marks on some such basis as 5 old for 1 new, and make all debts come some such basis as 5 old for 1 new, and make all debts and contracts payable in the new marks at the same ratio in place of the old. Let experts decide the exact ratio needed for this operation, which will aim to bring the price level down to that of 1937. Thereafter, changes in the total supply of means of payment should be made to correspond to changes in the national capacity to produce. lower taxes to revive incentives and the profit motive, remove all limitations on scientific research and invention, with prohibitions continued only in the fields of atomic fission, poison gas and weapons of war, draw up a peace treaty with Germany and officially end the war. Allow the Germans to set up a unified central government of their own choosing in harmony with the Atlantic Charter, with only such external controls as those mentioned below. Encourage the Germans to frame a constitution for themselves, with all parties advocating dictatorship or revolution barred from the Constitutional Convention. Thereupon withdraw all occupation troops, remove the military governments and abolish all zones, continue disarmament permanently, however, and prohibit production of munitions on all weapons of war, to enforce United Nations controls, install a system of observation and surprise inspection by roving patrols permitted to inspect any and all records and activities backed by the military might of the United States and other United Nations. Violators will be tried before German courts by Allied prosecutors, with verdicts subject to appeal and retrial if necessary before Allied tribunals. Insist on abolition of all discrimination in favor of displaced persons and others, and make all persons in Germany equal before the law. Withdraw the re-education program as gracefully and soon as possible. Replace the general anti-Nazi decrees with specific laws forbidding propagation and advocacy of certain clearly defined and specific ideas or activities, making these prohibitions apply to all alike. Now, here is what happened. Germany has no peace treaty as of this 1996 date. Germany has only been partially allowed to be reunited. No plebiscites were held in the areas where Germans lived before 1937. The solution of the Allies that they agreed to in Potsdam and in Yalta was to, and in Tehran, undoubtedly behind the scenes, was to drive the Germans out, and 17 million German people in effect lost their homes in Eastern Europe and all their property. The German nation collectively was robbed mercilessly. Germany today is still 50 years plus after the war a vassal state of the Allies. It is a repressive regime that allows no freedom of speech the way we know it. And America and the rest of the Western Allies have a lot to answer for with the situation now in Germany. I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program. Auf Wiedersehen.